So let's try and make sense of which way the US election is poised to go, because the consequences of who's going to be the next occupant of the White House, those consequences are going to be far and wide. It's going to have an impact on the Israel-Hamas war and also on the Russia-Ukraine war. Joining us now is Professor John Mearsheimer. He's Professor Emeritus at the Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago. Thank you very much, Professor, for speaking with us here on CNN News 18.
My pleasure to be here.
All right, let's start with the polls in America. There is obviously huge interest around the world in these elections in the U.S. It's arguably one of the closest that we're seeing in almost a generation in U.S. presidential contests. So we've just done an average of all the polls that have been out in the month of September, and the average reads as follows. Kamala Harris with 49.2% of the popular vote, and Donald Trump with 45.8%. So there's about a 3-4% gap between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump as of today. What is your reading of where the presidential contest stands right now? Who would you put your money on to be the winner in November if you were a betting man today?
Well, all I would say is that you want to remember that in the United States, the popular vote does not determine who becomes the president. If it did, Hillary Clinton would have won in 2016. It's where the votes end up in the Electoral College. And that means that a series of swing states in the United States really determine who becomes the president. There are a number of states that are going to go for Kamala Harris no matter what. And there are a number of states that are going to go for Donald Trump no matter what. And the critical question is what happens in the swing states. And if you actually look at what's going on in the swing states, Donald Trump is doing very well. This is not to say he's doing much better than Kamala Harris, but he's basically neck and neck, if not slightly ahead in a number of those swing states. So Donald Trump could very well end up being the president, even if he loses the popular vote.
So what explains that, especially what we've seen, not just in the first term of Donald Trump, the kind of almost chaos that we saw when he was president, and then thereafter in 2020, after he lost the election, the whole insurrection and so on, and then multiple felony charges that have been brought against him. And despite all of that, if he is still competitive, as you're saying, and perhaps even leading in some of those swing states, then what explains it?
Well, the fact is that there are fundamental political differences between Americans, and there are a lot of people who think that the Democrats are the font of all evil. And almost no matter who is the Republican nominee, they'll vote for that Republican. Many Republicans fully understand that Trump has all sorts of liabilities, but they think that Trump with liabilities is better than the Democrats. So it's just important to understand that these deep fissures in the American body politic make it possible for someone like Donald Trump, despite all his legal troubles and other troubles, to be competitive.
The journey of Kamala Harris, and as you'd expect, there is a great amount of interest in Harris here in India because of her origins, her ancestry. She was not the nominee of the Democratic Party. It was Joe Biden. Joe Biden had a disastrous debate performance back in June, where it was visible to everyone that he's not there mentally up there for this job, and then he withdrew. What do you make of Harris's journey thereafter, from Biden withdrawing, the fact that she managed to close out the nomination quite quickly, had a bit of a tepid phase after the convention, but then after the debate, which was in the second week of September, she seems to have had a bump up again. What do you make of the trajectory of Kamala Harris in the last 2 or 3 months?
Well, she has a number of liabilities. She was not highly regarded before she became a candidate. I don't think she is especially good at articulating her views on foreign policy and on domestic policy. And she has the problem that she's seen as being joined at the hip with Joe Biden. She is the vice president, so she is running on the administration's record. But Those problems notwithstanding, I think she has done, by almost all accounts, a brilliant job of running the campaign since she became the nominee after Joe Biden stepped down. She's done a great job, and that's why she is doing so well. What actually happens in the end in early November is hard to say. But you have to admit, I think, that Kamala Harris has done the best possible job given the difficult circumstances that she was facing once she became the nominee.
The polling that we've had most recently seems to indicate that, as you said earlier, Trump seems to be leading in many of what's called the Sun Belt states, Georgia, Arizona, North Carolina. But in the Rust Belt, which is Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, it is a narrow lead for Harris. Do you see her path to 270 easier than that of Trump's, or is Trump's path to 270 easier than that of Harris?
I mean, it's almost impossible to say. There's so much time left between now and the vote in early November that anything could happen. Trump could stumble, and Harris could stumble. It's just very hard to say, how this is going to play out. And furthermore, as you well know from the Indian case, and I well know from the American case, you can never trust polls too much because polls sometimes get it wrong. So figuring out who's going to win this election at this point in time is almost impossible.
That happened in 2016 too, when almost all the polls were suggesting that it would be a landslide win for Hillary Clinton. There was, in hindsight, a sort of under-reporting and under-counting by the pollsters of the Trump voter for whatever reason. Do you see that being the case 8 years down in this election cycle as well, or do you see that having changed? Because Trump is no longer an unknown entity. Everybody knows whether you like him or dislike him. He's not an unknown commodity.
I think that, number one, there's so much dissatisfaction with the Democratic Party, especially with Joe Biden, that I wouldn't be surprised if there are lots of people who are going to vote for Trump, but just won't admit it. The fact is that in polite company, you don't want to admit that you're going to vote for Trump if you're going to vote for Trump. And number two, I have a number of friends who will not admit that they're going to vote for Trump, but I have a strong sense that when they go, into the voting booth, they will pull the lever for Trump because of their dislike of the Democrats. Moreover, you want to remember that there are a lot of people who are deeply angry about the Biden administration who cannot bring themselves to vote for Trump, and they'll vote for someone like Jill Stein or some other independent candidate, or maybe just not vote at all. And if that happens, that will play to Trump's advantage, because a lot of those people would have otherwise voted for Harris, for Kamala Harris. And by the way, you see this with the Arab American community. There is huge dissatisfaction, as you can appreciate, inside of the Arab American community with the Biden administration, in large part because it's been supporting the genocide in Gaza. And the end result of that is a lot of those people are not going to vote for the Biden administration, are not going to vote for Kamala Harris, and that will hurt her. But again, how this all plays out in November is very hard to say.
All right, I want to come to some of the ramifications of the vote and the fallout of whoever is going to be the next president. What may that be? On first, the two wars that we're pressed with. Since you started with the Israel-Hamas war, let me ask you that. Do you see any significant positional difference between Trump and Harris, depending on who comes to the White House, and how that may impact the war? Do you reckon if Harris were to become president, she might pressurize Netanyahu more for a ceasefire than if Trump were to be president?
No, I don't think it'll make any difference at all. I think whether you have Trump or you have Harris in the White House, we will support Israel unconditionally. This is just the way American politics works. There's no president on the horizon who could put any meaningful pressure on Israel. It's just not going to happen.
But how can this go on? It's going to be close to a year now since the war against Hamas started. More than 40,000 people have died. And now there is a new front that Israel has seemingly opened against Hezbollah in the northern part of that country. I mean, many say this is untenable.
Well, you want to remember that the Ukraine war is heading towards its third year. So these wars can go on for a long time. I don't see the war in the Middle East ending anytime soon. And even if you get a ceasefire, as you well know, there is going to be a conflict of one sort or another between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and between Hezbollah and the Israelis, and maybe even between the Iranians and the Israelis over time. I mean, there's really no hope of putting an end to this colossal disaster in the Middle East.
Do you see this continuing in a way that Iran will eventually have to get in the mix, if you will, because Israel's battling Hamas on the south, Hezbollah in the north, and there's also the Houthi attacks that are happening from time to time, and all of these are basically proxies for the Iranian regime?
Well, I think there is a serious possibility that the Iranians will have to come in. And it won't involve Hamas, and it won't involve the Houthis. It'll involve Hezbollah. It appears that the Israelis are deeply interested in escalating the conflict with their conflict with Hezbollah. It's obvious that their first goal is to try to coerce Hezbollah to end its firing of rockets and missiles into Israel. This is a huge problem for Israel, and the Israelis are bashing Lebanon and Hezbollah in particular for the purpose of trying to coerce Hezbollah to stop firing those missiles. But I think there's an alternative or a second goal here, and that is to inflict enough damage on Lebanon that Iran comes into the fight. The Israelis are itching to get the Iranians and the Americans into a war. There's just no question about that in my mind, and in the minds of most people I know who study this issue. So I think the Israelis would like it very much if Iran comes or tries to come to the rescue of Hezbollah, in which case the Americans will surely come in, and then you'd have a war between the United States and Iran. And of course, the Israelis would be allied with the United States. This is a long-term goal of the Israelis, and this conflict with Hezbollah may make that happen.
If you could just elaborate on that point, because it's a very interesting point that you touch upon. A, why would Israel want that? Because if we're going to have an Iran-America clash, it's pretty much akin to almost like a world war. And number two, after 20 years of multiple wars, first in Afghanistan and then in Iraq, do you reckon there is a pro-war, if not an open-to-war kind of a mood in America? Because it's been anti-war since the last 20 years, in the history of the last 20 years.
Let me make a couple points. First of all, there's no question the United States does not want a war with Iran. Mm-hmm. We've made that very clear. And there's no question that the Iranians don't want a war with the United States. And indeed, the Iranians don't want a war with Israel either. Right? So it's the Israelis who want to drag the Americans and the Iranians into a fight. And what's going on here is that by hammering Hezbollah and hammering Lebanon, the Israelis are putting the Iranians in a situation where they may just have to come in to try to rescue Hezbollah and to rescue Lebanon. This is what you were getting at before, and I think that's exactly right. Well, if Iran comes in, it's very difficult for me to imagine the United States staying out. So this is the main scenario. Second point I would make to you is that you want to remember that Israel has tried twice to drag the United States into a war with Iran. First, on April 1st of this year, when the Israelis attacked the Iranian embassy in Damascus, in Syria. Mm-hmm. And we actually had a fight between Iran on one side and Israel and the United States on the other side on April 14th. So the United States and Iran have gone after each other in a very measured way on April 14th. And then on July 31st, the Israelis killed Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas, in, of all places, Tehran. And the Iranians have vowed that they're going to retaliate. Well, this was designed in large part by the Israelis to drag the United States and Iran into a war. So there is no question in my mind the Israelis would like to see this war.
I want to get one more question in on Israel Hamas and Israel Hezbollah before I come to the other war, which is Russia Ukraine. I had the Israeli ambassador here in India recently on my program, and he said two things. He said the war with Hamas, at least militarily, is pretty much over. He believes Hamas today is not in a position to be able to launch another October 7th style attack. So militarily, at least he feels that the war with Hamas is coming down to a close. On the Hezbollah question, his contention was the government of Israel had been trying since October 7th, since they launched the operation against Hamas, to convince Lebanon to do something to stop Hezbollah from these daily rocket fires across the border. Diplomatically, they were not successful. Therefore, now they are trying to militarily stop Hezbollah from doing that. And his contention was this is going to be a limited operation. They are trying to raise the level of escalation with Hezbollah so high that it becomes a deterrent which would stop Hezbollah from the daily rocket fire, the daily rocket barrages into Israel. Do you buy that?
Well, let's just talk about Hamas to begin with, then go to Hezbollah. With regard to Hamas, the Israelis have not defeated Hamas. You want to remember that Benjamin Netanyahu said that his goal in Gaza was to decisively defeat Hamas. Hamas is alive and well. They've reconstituted the various battalions that comprised the fighting forces before October 7th. They have a huge manpower pool that they can draw upon. And the idea that Israel has put an end to Hamas is delusional. There's no question that Hamas is now not in a position to replicate what it did on October 7th. But that's a different matter. The key point you want to keep in mind is that they have not decisively defeated Hamas. With regard to Hezbollah, I think what you describe as the Israeli goal is correct. And I tried to make this point before, that what the Israelis are trying to do is they're trying to hit Lebanon hard enough and to hit Hezbollah hard enough that they throw up their hands and surrender to the Israelis and say, we will no longer continue to attack northern Israel in response to what you're doing in Gaza. And the question you want to ask yourself is, do you think that they will succeed? You believe that Hezbollah will roll over and surrender. I would not bet a lot of money that they will. Now, this idea that the Lebanese government can convince Hezbollah or coerce Hezbollah to cease its attacks on Israel is, again, delusional. This is not going to happen. Hezbollah is an independent actor. It's the most powerful actor in Lebanon, and the Lebanese government is in no position to coerce Hezbollah. And again, the question then boils down to whether or not you think Hezbollah will quit attacking Israel as long as Israel continues its war in Gaza. And I would bet the Israelis are not going to be successful. It's hard to say, with great certainty, but my understanding of the balance of power and the balance of resolve between Hezbollah and Israel tells me that Hezbollah will continue to fight. And this brings us to the question of whether or not the Israelis will launch a ground invasion into Lebanon. If the air campaign doesn't work, then will they be willing to send ground forces in? As they did in 1982 and as they did in 2006. Yep. In my view, the Israelis are in no position to do that. And if they did so, it would be a huge mistake on their part.
Let me come to the other war, which is Russia-Ukraine. And last month, you said that a Trump victory in November would push the U.S. away from NATO expansionism, and that in a way would work in favor of Russia. It could possibly end the war. And consequently, you've also said that if Harris were to be elected as president in November, then Putin might double down on the war against Ukraine, the war in Ukraine. Could you again elaborate on that hypothesis?
Sure. Well, as I said, I don't think there's any difference between Harris on one hand and Trump on the other hand when it comes to the Middle East. But I do think there's a fundamental difference with regard to the Ukraine war. That's the one foreign policy issue where there is a deep disagreement. And there's no question that the Trump administration would like to end the war in Ukraine as quickly as possible. And I think it's quite clear that the Trump administration, or should Donald Trump get elected in 2024, would like to improve relations with Russia. And at the same time, it has little interest in continuing to maintain NATO in its present form. Harris, on the other hand, is interested in maintaining the status quo. Harris will do everything possible to back Ukraine forever and to continue this war for as long as possible. Despite that difference, what really matters here is what's happening on the battlefield. And what's happening on the battlefield is that the Russians are winning the war. If you look at the daily reports that are now even beginning to appear in the West on the balance of power on the Eastern Front and what's happening in Kursk, it's quite clear that the Ukrainians are in deep trouble. And if you look at what's happening with the air war and the extent to which the Russian Air Force and Russian air power is tearing apart the energy infrastructure in Ukraine, it's clear that Russia is going to win this war. It's not going to be a decisive victory. Russia's not going to end up conquering all of Ukraine, but it is going to end up conquering a huge slice of territory, and Ukraine is going to be wrecked. It's going to be left as a dysfunctional rump state. And whether Harris is the president or Donald Trump is the president, both of them are going to have to work out some sort of deal with the Russians to create what I would say is a ceasefire or a cold peace.
So that cold peace or a ceasefire would necessarily involve a change of the map of Ukraine as we knew it before February 2022. That is, Ukraine will have to sort of reconcile itself to conceding some amount of territory. We don't know how much that is, 20%, 25%, I don't know. But it will definitely have to concede a substantial amount of territory in the East if there were to be a cold peace.
I don't think that Ukraine will ever concede that lost territory. There's no question the Russians are taking territory and they are formally annexing that territory to Russia. So the Crimean Peninsula and those 4 oblasts in eastern Ukraine, almost all of which the Russians now control, they have been formally annexed to Russia. And the Russians have no intention of ever giving that territory back to Ukraine. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, accept the fact that the Russians now control that territory, but they will never concede, in my opinion, that that is Russian territory forever.
All right, and one final word. Just in the last few months, the Indian Prime Minister, he first went to Moscow, met with Putin. A few weeks later, he went to Kiev, met with Zelensky. And this week, on the sidelines of the UNGA, he's met with both Zelensky and Mahmoud Abbas, who's the head of the Palestinian Authority. Do you see India having any kind of a role in being able to help solve either of these two wars, or at least bring in some kind of a cold peace or a ceasefire, as you mentioned?
No, I don't think so. And I don't think anybody can do much to end the conflict in the Middle East, except for the United States. And the United States cannot put any meaningful pressure on Israel, in large part because of domestic politics in the United States. The power of the Israel lobby is so great that no American president can coerce the Israelis to change their behavior. So the Israelis are pretty much free to do what they want. And it's not possible for India to do anything in the Middle East. And with regard to the Ukraine-Russia conflict, I think that there's little India can do there as well. I mean, it may be possible that if someone is looking for a negotiator or a mediator down the road to work with negotiators from both sides, that maybe India could come into play. I doubt that, because I think India is seen as an ally of Russia by many Ukrainians. So I think that would be, hard to pull off. But I don't think India has a large role to play here. And again, it's just because of the structure of these two conflicts.
All right. Professor John Mearsheimer, it's always a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you very much for joining us here on CNN News 18.
It was my pleasure.